Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Lamia Al-Ghamdi from Imam Abdurrahman University, level 4 RC student. We will discover today and represent a synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation SIMV mode. The outline is what is the SIMV mode, how does it work, indication, complication, and how to set it. First, what's the meaning of SIMV mode? It is a synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation, which is type of volume or pressure control mode of ventilation. With this mode, the ventilator will deliver a set mandatory breath, a number of breaths with a set volume or pressure, while at the same time allowing spontaneous breath. A spontaneous breath are delivered when the airway pressure drops below and expiratory pressure triggers. In another word, is a mode in which the ventilator delivers either assisted breath to the patient at the beginning of a spontaneous breath or a time-triggered breath mandatory breath. So we have two windows, a mandatory and the spontaneous. The spontaneous, it allows the patient to take whatever he wants, depend on patient efforts. But in the mandatory, it will be set rate that delivered to the patient, and when the patient try to take a breath, it will be assisted breath, not a spontaneous. So patient can trigger and then take the set volume or set pressure. Yes. Also another thing, when the patient try to take a spontaneous breath at the beginning of mandatory phase, it will be assisted breath. How does it work? Once the patient is ready to initiate SIMV mode, it requires the appropriate setting on the ventilator. The parameter include tidal volume if it is volume controlled, or pressure controlled if it is SIMV pressure controlled. Respiratory rate, positive index respiratory pressure, FI2. If used the pressure support setting, also we can add pressure support. After the initiation of mechanical ventilation, it's the best practice to obtain an arterial blood gas within 60 minutes and to titrate the ventilator setting accordingly. Mode characteristic. There is a 3 characteristic we have to know. First, the type of breath, mandatory and or spontaneous, as we said before. Triggering mechanism. With mandatory phase, it will be time or patient triggered. With spontaneous, patient triggered. Cycling mechanism with SIMV volume ventilation, volume cycled. If the volume delivered and reached, it will end and start exhalation. With the SIMV pressure ventilation, time cycled, and spontaneous will be flow cycled. Here the SIMV mode, pressure targeted. This is the mandatory phase that there is a set pressure delivered. If the patient try to take a breath, it will be assist breath with trigger. And here the spontaneous window or spontaneous breath that the patient take the breath depend on patient's effort. And this is the setting in SIMV pressure controlled. We set the FI2, beep, SIMV rate, pressure control above beep, IA ratio to manipulate the inspiratory time and change it. Breath cycle, which is a unique feature in SIMV that determine what's the time for mandatory. For example, if it's 4, that means there is 4 seconds for mandatory breath, and when multiplied by 12, it will be a 48 second in the whole minute. It is a mandatory window, and the 12 remaining will be for a spontaneous window and distributed within the set breath. SIMV volume targeted, which is volume controlled, as you see in the flow wave square, and the volume will delivered, and this is assisted breath because of the trigger. And this is the spontaneous window or spontaneous breath that the patient can take the breath depending his effort. This is SIMV volume control setting. It's the same with the pressure control. The difference is we will set a tidal volume here. Indication for synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation is typically help wean patient from ventilator to avoid respiratory alkalosis by allowing patient to achieve normal alveolar ventilation through an intact ventilator drive. In severe hypoxic and hypercapnic respiratory failure, often after a failed trial of non-invasive ventilation. The last thing, which is a complication of SIMV mode or synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation, is a ventilator mode that enables partial mechanical assistance. This ventilator mode will provide a set number of breaths at fixed tidal volume, but a patient can trigger a spontaneous breath with volume determined by patient effort. The maximum benefit of SIMV may only be realized by patients who can take a spontaneous breath. And thank you for listening. This is our reference, and I hope it was easy for you to understand.